Okay, I'm going to charge forth, so please let me know if you don't hear me, okay? For one reason or another. Faith of a surgeon, many times God has been my partner in healing. We have to define faith, first of all. Faith is the unquestionable belief that does not require proof or knowledge. And in the Bible, Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Also, Hebrews 11:6, without faith, it's impossible to please God, for the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and to reward those who seek him. This is a journey. I am pleased to say that I've gotten this old that I can look back on my life, and at least what participated, my becoming a physician. Next slide. And that strapping young person is me at 1.5 years old, in front of my great-grandfather's house in Reinholds. My father and mother, my father was a steel worker and a part-time carpenter, and my mother a housewife and part-time artist. And they saw fit not to have any further children with me, other than me, I should say. And so I'm an only child, as they say in these days. I'm frankly proud of being an only child. Next slide. After growing up in Norristown, we attended Grace Lutheran Church there, by the way. I don't know whether you know where that is, but it's on Lafayette Street, Norristown. And anyway, we moved to Jeffersonville, and in the center of the picture up there, this guy with a cowboy shirt on is me, and the rest of my cohort that's at the West Norton School. I was at the 4th grade at that time, and this is dated 1949. Having matriculated there, my dad decided that he was going to move us up to a place called Trapp, which I had never heard of before. And so we moved from Jeffersonville to Trapp. Next slide. And I learned how to drive on this Farmall tractor. This is me at 13, and this is in the construction of our house up there. Dad had previously built a house with my uncle in Jeffersonville, and we bought this land, which was like 12 acres of land in Trapp, and built a house on. Next slide. So I learned all the good things about carrying cement blocks and hammering and all sorts of things, and we stayed here for about 4 or 5 years. And during that time, I was at Collegeville Trapp Junior Senior High School, which unfortunately is no longer present. It's now condos, but it's on First Avenue in Trapp if you ever pass that area. We joined Augustus Lutheran Church, and next slide, please. And you know where that is, and you've been there, and I've been there many times. And so next slide. And next. And this was our confirmation class, and I'm on the left, 2nd row, and with a crew cut. I used to have a crew cut in those days. And during that period of time, especially during junior high school, I was formulating what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Even at that young age, I was thinking about those things. And it was during the Sputnik period of time. Russia had launched a satellite. Everybody was going crazy in the United States because we didn't have one there. And I got interested in aeronautical work and thought I was going to be an aeronautical engineer. So I went through algebra, did that fine, and got through some geometry. But when I hit trigonometry, that was like a brick wall. And I had to have a friend of mine help me with that to get through. So I then started developing an interest in biology. And I had a very nice biology teacher by the name of Miss Berger. Next slide, please. And during this time, I even thought about being a minister because Billy Graham had his New York crusade in 1957. And I took about 24 pictures, this is from the television, of him preaching. And I then decided I wasn't going to be a minister because I was getting more and more interested in biology and figuring that by 10th grade, I decided pretty much that I wanted to be a doctor. Next slide. This is my mentor, the man with the bow tie, and that's Dr. Edgar Byers. He was a family doctor and had his office on DeKalb Street in Norristown. He was a challenging and very interesting man. Literally saved my life twice. During the war, there was a shortage of penicillin. I came down with bronchopneumonia. He used sulfa. Somehow I survived. 2 years later, I came down with another bout of bronchopneumonia. By this time, penicillin was readily available. For the war, it was readily available for the troops, but not for civilians. And I'm here, thanks to him. But later on in life, I got interested more and more in medicine, and he gave me a copy of Gray's Anatomy, which is the anatomy book for first-year students in medicine. And I started reading it. It was a very interesting book for me. Next slide. So I decided to go into pre-med, and I went to Ursinus College. Next slide. Which was very convenient. It was not only close, but it was convenient. And in those days, the tuition was $600, I think. But just to judge what it's like compared to today, which is about $45,000. But anyway, I was at Ursinus College and studying biology. I minored in chemistry. I then went, next slide, graduated, next slide, and studied at Temple University Medical School. I was extremely fortunate to be accepted there. It was and is a great school. I studied initially anatomy. As you may understand, that the study of medicine is a graduated thing. You just don't jump into it. I should point out that when Dr. Byers was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, back toward the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, or beginning, they did not have pre-med schools. You had an apprenticeship. If you were interested in high school, you would then go directly into medical school. And I'm privileged enough to have some of his diaries from that period of time, which from the clinical standpoint is absolutely amazing, and features some maladies that we don't have today. So the first 2 years at Temple was the preclinical years, and then third and fourth clinical. Between the second and my third year at Temple, I wanted to earn a few bucks. I had basically paid my way through Ursinus, but through gracious, an individual who was very gracious to me, got me some money so I could go to medical school. Anyway, I decided that they had an externship down in Wilmington, Delaware, at the Delaware Hospital. Now, what that meant was that as a fledgling doctor or pre-med or medical student, I could go down there and work in the operating room, get a few bucks here and there, etc. And that's what really piqued my interest in surgery. Before that, I was interested in medicine, just general medicine. But I worked in the operating room. I held retractors, I cut suture. I didn't operate, of course, but I did help out. And as a bonus to that, there was this very nice looking blonde nurse who was the head of the surgery ward that I got to know pretty well and dated. And actually, that was like 55 years ago. So since she's still with me, she's seen to put up with my druthers and all kinds of idiosyncrasies. And we married in Concordia Lutheran Church in Wilmington, Delaware in 1966 in January. It was a cold day, it was snowing, and God was watching over us because somehow we got through the whole thing. We lived in Claymont, Delaware for the last 6 months of medical school, and I commuted, got up usually at 4:30 in the morning, took the train up, went to conferences, did whatever I had to do up there, and then graduated from Temple in 1966, in June of 1966. Then, during that period of time was the Vietnam War. And most of us doctors either were drafted or else we had to sign up. The better part of valor was to sign up. So I had an uncle who had been in the Army Air Corps during World War II, and I decided to go into the Air Force. So I signed the Air Force papers and became a lieutenant. And the next step from Temple was then, as a lieutenant, was to go to my internship, which was at Reading Hospital. The internship at that time, and I always have to explain this to my students because they don't understand what internship is. They think it's a first-year residency, which it really isn't or wasn't. An internship was another step toward better medical education, where you would take a year at a hospital, usually in the East Coast, and I signed for Reading, and you would be rotating through various specialties on 3-month blocks. So we spent the year between 1966 and 67 in the brick apartments, if you know where they are, on Penn Avenue, on the 3rd floor, with virtually no money and only what my wife had in her apartment as furniture. So we did all that. Anyhow, from there on, I was waiting at the end of my internship. I was waiting to take basic training in Texas, and there was a 2-month cap. So during that time, the Reading Hospital was kind enough to keep me on, pay me for working in the operating room, and I came upon this one plastic surgeon who kind of took me under his wing, and I got interested in plastic surgery. So that's how I got interested in plastic surgery here. I knew that from surgery, I wanted to do surgery. I was good with my hands and with my brain, but I wanted to do something more specialized. So that's where that started. The next step was the Air Force. I was up at Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts, and the years of 1967 to 69 were the Air Force years. I was not a surgeon there because I did not have a year of surgical residency, and therefore they kept you on the general medical staff. But during that time, something happened that I had no way, that only God knew that I would ever participate in what I participated in the Air Force later in my life. And that was, we had acquired a decompression chamber. Next slide. Next slide. This was my internship picture, by the way, before I go on. And if you can see that strapping young figure there on the right with the glasses on to the left, that's me. And there was a great influence, by the way, during that time, Ben Casey and Dr. Kildare and a few others. And the tunics that they wore, that's what we wore. So I'm not sure whether we look like we're going to take people to Bellevue or what, but that's what we wore. So next slide. Air Force years. And they had some problems with the aircraft with decompression sickness. We use high performance, high altitude aircraft. And contrary to what people think of decompression sickness, that is the Benz, Caisson's disease, another name for it, where the patient gets very severe cramping and can even die with nitrogen going back into their bloodstream too quickly because of changing pressure. It used to be the Navy divers that got that only, but with the onset of jet propulsion, high altitude aircraft and pilots would get it. So we had a decompression chamber on base, and they needed 2 volunteers. I was one of them, and Mike Cass, who was a friend of mine, he was an internist, was another. Next slide. So we were testing this. This is kind of blurry, but it gives you an idea of how cramped the quarters were. Here you have a patient, a doctor, and you have 1 nurse and some equipment. And we did very deep dives equivalent to 200 feet below water. Of course, we didn't go below water. We got 200 feet pressure-wise. And this would later evolve, this treatment would later evolve into what's called hyperbaric medicine today. And we had a fellow who, by the name of Jeff Davis, no relation to Jeff Davis from the Confederacy, who was a major at that time, who would come around to our bases and check for safety features on these various chambers. So following this, as I said, I spent 2 years in the Air Force, and following that, we went to, next slide, this place, which is the modern graduate hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. My surgical residency began here. I spent 4 years at Graduate. The typical training period for plastic surgery in those days was 5 years general surgery, 2 years plastic surgery residency, and then go into practice. And you had to pass 2 tests at the end of all of that. So I spent 4 years at Graduate. Next slide. And this is the house staff. If you look to the far right, that guy, the second guy with his head there with the mustache, that's me. And the house staff was a United Nations, literally, of doctors. We had people from all over. We had all races, religion. We had people from China, from Germany, from Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. They all came, and it was noted for that because if an individual from a foreign country, especially a specialist, needed to have training, they had to go through the whole residency program again. We had one fellow who was a Royal College of Surgeons recipient who I got to be very good friends with, and he was a vascular surgeon. He had to go through the whole residency, spent time at Graduate, and then finally went into practice and went back to my hometown in Norristown. So there were 2 events that really hit me when I was at Graduate. I was there for only probably 2 months, a very green first-year surgical resident. I participated in surgeries. I was on call this one weekend, and this played a great deal in the hardening of my faith, that's to say, dependence upon God. I was called to the emergency room by one of the chief residents in internal medicine for a young fellow who was 17, got stabbed in the chest. He came in, they put him on an exam table. He was basically dying on the table. They had started intravenous's, and I got there at the time when his pressure was practically unobtainable, blood pressure. I checked his chest. He had a small stab wound right over top of the heart. And they looked upon me, a green resident, to do something to bring him back to life. So I opened his chest right there and found that his heart was not beating. In fact, was encased by blood, and the layer over the heart called the pericardium contained this blood. So I took a scalpel and opened it, and the blood came forth, and within probably less than 5 seconds, his blood pressure went from a systolic, that is the upper number, of about 60 to 100. And he continued to do well after that. And I called my chief resident, who was at the time eating crabs at home, on kind of taking the day off. And I told him what I did, and he said, well, he said, where is this patient now? I said, he's on his way to the operating room. We're going to close his chest. So after that, I had a new realization of my power, but not just me alone, but it was only God that permitted me to go through that and do that. And everything else, all the other operations were kind of secondary to that moment. I was I was so pleased with myself too, that the next day, our chief, Dr. Blakemore, who's pictured in this picture, he's the center tall guy there. I said to him, you know, boy, that was really some experience. And I had a big smile on my face. And he looked at me and he said, just don't be too cocky. There's more to come. Okay. Anyway, so the training of a surgeon is a graduated process, as I probably indicated. And I was at the first year. I spent 3 more years at Graduate. And one of those was a rotation through Children's Hospital. That was another experience that I'll never forget. Most of the patients were being operated on by Dr. C. Everett Koop, who happened to be the founder of the hospital, the pediatric section of the hospital, pediatric surgery. And C. Everett Koop later became Surgeon General of the United States. I operated with him frequently. In fact, one day I was doing a hernia repair on this little child with Coop, and the nurse came into the operating room and she said, "Would you step out a minute, Dr. Smith?" I said, "Fine." I didn't know what she wanted, and he let me go. He said, "Go ahead." So I went out, and she told me that I had a phone call, and actually my father had suddenly passed away, and Dr. Coop was very gracious, of course, and giving me some time off for that and handling the family affairs. So we made rounds with him. He was a gentleman. He was a true Christian. He was Episcopalian. He wasn't Lutheran, but he was a true Christian. And so that's another one of my little experiences at graduate. My final year in surgery was spent at Geisinger. Put that one on, that next one. That just shows me operating in the operating room down there, doing a case. Next slide. And this was with Carlisle. We spent 4 months at Carlisle as a rotation. Next. And there's Geisinger. And I spent a year at Geisinger as the chief resident in surgery at Geisinger. It was another very interesting experience. We had another one of our children born there. We had 3 daughters. The first was born at Reading during internship. The second was born in the Air Force at Otis. And the third was born at Geisinger. And while we were there at Geisinger, we had a little Lutheran church down the street that we would attend whenever I could. And when I wasn't on call, I was on call most of the time there because I was the chief resident and in charge of the general surgery section under the chief of surgery. This, if you look to the right, that building was the only building that was there at the time when I was there. All the rest of this building, all the addition is new. So then on to plastic surgery residency. Next. And this is Hershey from the air. And I went to Hershey Medical Center between 1974 and 76, 2 years of plastic surgery. To say the least, it was very tight and very stressful, as was all the previous general surgery. But particularly at Hershey, we were farmed out to different hospitals, and my wife and I bought a house in a place called Chambers Hill, Harrisburg, and it's the first time in many years that I became a Methodist. And that is to say, we joined a Methodist church because there were no Lutheran churches close by. And fortunately, this Chambers Hill Methodist Church was so close that my wife could take our 3 daughters and we would go there for church. This became really crucial later on because I had a rotation in Erie. And it was the last 6 months of my rotation, my last 6 months at Hershey. And I was up there alone, and my wife was at Chambers Hill in Harrisburg with 3 children, taking care of them. And we saw each other, I think, at least for a day or so, 3 times during that 6 months until the very end. And then they were able to, because the girls were out of school, the 4 of them could come up and stay with me up in Erie. There was a St. John's Lutheran Church, I think it was St. John's at Erie, that I participated in while I was up there when I could go for services. I was kind of interested in that too, because they had a pretty good congregation from the volume standpoint, but they had a beautiful choir, and I remember distinctly feeling like I was singing alone because nobody would sing. I thought, this doesn't seem right. But it was just one of those things, I guess, from the congregational standpoint. One thing that happened when we were up at Hammett Hospital in Erie was that it was right along, of course, the coast west of Erie, Lake Erie. And the last several months, the last month I was there, we were walking with the family along the shore, the sandy beach there with rocks and so forth. And I had my little daughter, who was Chris. I think she was a year and a half at that time, and she stepped on in a a valley or something in the beach where the water came in, a big wave came in, and she disappeared under the water. And I almost lost her. I had her in hand, and for a split second, we lost contact. And if I wouldn't have got her, she would not be here today. So I have to, thank God for that she's still here. And she and her husband produced 2 of our 6 grandchildren too. So the plastic surgery regimen, as I said, is very rigid and strict, and one has to pass 2 tests after you go through all that residency period. I started practice back in Reading with Dr. Preserpi and his partner in 1976. We were busy all the time. We were on the staff of 5 hospitals, traveling almost all the time. And it was a very tough business. And that's at the period of time when my family joined Advent Lutheran Church. And the test that is taken with plastic surgery is a written and has to do with all kinds of clinical situations. I passed that. 2 years later, they have an oral examination. And the oral examination is extremely difficult because you have to present 24 of your cases that you've done within the past 2 years to a group of individuals who are basically above you in being part of the plastic surgery group. And that was held in San Francisco at the St. Francis Hotel. I can tell you that I did a lot of praying before that. I had a lot of knowledge, but I had a lot of praying as well. And there were at least 40% of people don't pass that test the first time, and I passed it. And I got my boards in 1978. Next slide. This was a half staff at Hershey, by the way. And I don't know whether you can see me, but I'm, let's see, second row to the left, and then Bill Graham, my chief, is there next to me. That's the entire, at that time, the entire surgical house staff. And we're in front of the hospital. Next slide. During my time in about 1978, after I passed my plastic boards, I got a notification that I'd been recommended to be a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. And later that year, I went to Chicago and I received my gown and the blue sash. The red sash and the blue gown. Next. In 1981, I saw fit to go out on my own. This was a big leap of faith because the 2 plastic surgeons who were there in Reading were the only ones in Reading at that time. And so if somebody were to split, it was not exactly an amicable relationship after that for a while. So this was my office. You can still see it today. You can see where I sold it after I went into retirement. But it actually was 2 duplex houses that combined. And I bought the second one. I bought 926, which is the one on the right first, and then reconstructed it to have the whole first floor as a waiting room and examining rooms. Okay, next slide. And next slide. And that's me operating. Next slide. So during this time, some guys that play golf, some guys do other things for fun. I decided to fly an airplane. I'd always wanted to do that. And there was a school over at Reading Airport called CAP Aviation at the time. And I went and took lessons. And I got my private pilot's rating. Next slide. And my instrument rating, which means that you can fly in just about any weather. And I even bought a plane. Next. And 9393 Quebec was my baby. And I used to call it my mistress. And my wife said, yeah, what mistress? I said, my airplane. And so we would fly together. And I can tell you that it takes a lot of faith, both in God and the mechanical ability of yourself and the airplane to fly a 4-seat airplane. And we flew quite far. We went down to Charleston and back and so forth. And I thought that I was carrying out some Christian duty with this because my mother, who was still alive at the time, her aunt lived in New Jersey, and Aunt Mamie was kind of a recluse. She lived by herself with her cats, and she had little or no money. And my mom's big thrill was to go down to stay with Aunt Mamie. And Aunt Mamie was one of these ladies and one of these persons that nobody wanted to have anything to do with, even though she was a lovely person. And so I'd fly her down there to Hamilton Airport. And that would happen at least once every 2 weeks. So I got some flight time involved as well, but it was really my pleasure to do that. Unfortunately, about 6 years ago, I was not doing much flying because I was busy with other things, and I decided to sell the plane. And next slide. I decided I had enough with, I was working myself almost to death, and decided to go into retirement in 2004. I did some writing, I did some photography, I did some oil painting. But I got to tell you that I really fell into almost a depression in a sense because I was not around people, and I had to have people in order to take care of, my inner needs, as it were, because I thought that was my calling. So lo and behold, one day over at the Poly Zone, one of my friends who was an orthopedic surgeon comes by and he says, they started up this wound care center over at Reading Hospital, and they really need another doctor. They're really quite busy. So I said, okay, I'll look at it. Maybe I'll do it for a year or two. So I'm doing it part-time, and now I'm medical director, and that was back in 2008 when I joined them, and I'm still there. Now this is the Reading Hospital at Spring Ridge, and we're on the second floor. Next slide. Which brings us to hyperbaric medicine, which now reflects what I did back in the Air Force, because what was in the Air Force and basically non-clinical became clinical and scientific. And there's, without going into a big informational thing regarding hyperbarics, next slide. This is our chamber, and with John, who is our chamber attendant, and a person getting hyperbaric oxygen, which briefly is providing the body with 100% oxygen at pressures between 2 and 2.4 atmospheres. And what this does is to drive oxygen into the tissues to heal. And there are about 14 clinical indications for hyperbaric oxygen. We deal primarily with the late effects of radiation and chronic bone infections and diabetic foot ulcers. But there are others like carbon monoxide poisoning, etc. So we have 3 of these chambers. And I'm proud to say that I'm now the medical director of all this. And it's like full circle. Back in the Air Force days when I was doing the research work and diving, and now to this. I might add that back in the Air Force days, we were doing 6 atmospheres, which is equivalent to 200 feet below the water. We still have some people come in and say, well, if I have to go in the chamber, am I going to be underwater? And I say, nope, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with pressure. Next slide. So what does this all pretend? Well, we're about 10 after. You have faith in God, self-awareness, doctor, particularly a surgeon, knowledge, and humility. And I make sure that I have humility in there, because every scientist, and we are scientists, every scientist has to have humility that we don't know. And the more we know, the less we know. And with surgery, you have to have the ability, and you have to have dexterity and persistence and patience. And my episodes of faith were saving that boy's life at Graduate Hospital, of course, passing my plastic boards, which was a big deal. And I have to say one more thing, that when I had an episode where I had to be treated at University of Pennsylvania about 15 years ago, I was there overnight for a procedure, and my wife was going to pick me up, and she went by, and she doesn't have a great sense of direction, God bless her, but she wound up on Kelly Drive, not knowing how to get into Philadelphia. She pulled off at an Exxon station, and no, it was a Wawa. And she goes in and she asks, there's a guy sitting there getting some, I don't know what he was getting, but he said, "Where are you going, ma'am?" And she said, "I have to be in Philadelphia to pick up my husband, who is at University of Pennsylvania Hospital." And he said, "Oh, I know where to go. I'm going there." And so she followed him all the way to the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. Now, I believe in angels, and I don't know about you, but if that wasn't an angel, I don't know who he was. That whole thing, as she described it, was something that comes right out of a Godwink book. So I really, I have to relate that to you because it was a big thing in my life and in hers especially. Next slide. I throw a little, this is from Wall Street Journal. If you read that correctly, it says, "Fred, check and see if an elbow bump is legally binding." I just think that's kind of funny. But next slide. "You will show me the path of life, and your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forevermore." Psalm 16:11. And I end my talk with that, and I'm open to all questions. The next slide is thank you. So.
Okay. Excellent talk.
Can you,
Are there any questions?
Yeah, I would like to know, who is that plastic surgeon who got you inspired? Who was that person?
Dr. Preserpi.
No kidding. Really?
Sergio Preserpi. Yeah.
He took you under wing.
Yeah, and he took me down to Penn, and I met Royster, Dr. Royster, who was the head of plastics at Penn, and I joined him afterward. We had some disagreements, but that's why I split, because we had some disagreements, and I went out on my own. But later on, we reconciled, and everything went fine. And the poor man died of liver cancer, but I knew him, and we were friends at the end, so that worked out very well. It's a message of forgiveness too, I think, on both our parts.
Yeah. Do you know, is Manny Moser still alive?
Yes, as far as I know, he is. I saw him last about 4 or 5 years ago. He was in here. They decided to have a little party, and we were at Third and Spruce, and Manny was there. Yeah, he's still doing. I don't know what he's doing out in Kansas, but that's where he is.
Yeah.
Dr. Smith, it's George with a question.
Yeah.
One of the things I was very intrigued by is in some of your stories about faith and healing, you talked, I thought, about maybe a partnership between God and also maybe your hands and your knowledge in healing. Could you just talk a little bit more about how you feel about that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Let me say this: each time, I think when I decided to do some flying, there was a reason for that. First of all, when you're up there by yourself in an airplane and you're flying along, you seem like you're closer to God. At least I did, and that was a way of relaxation. But every time you go into an operating room, you have to have a plan. And you have a plan A, B, and sometimes C, because we take care of the biggest organ in the body, which is the skin. And there was so much knowledge, and your brain has to work in such a way that, and you, from the very beginning in anatomy at the temple, for instance, you recognize that there are some people and some doctors who are atheists, agnostics, but when you go into the human body and you see all the physiology and you go through the biochemistry, etc., there's no way a reasonable person can ever think that this was not God ordained. And the question I have, in fact, I hope to ask him someday, is why? And I saw this so much when I was at Children's Hospital. Why are little kids subject to all these bad things that happen to them? that require that we have to treat them in such a way. We have children's hospitals, thank God we do. But that's one of the things. I can understand the treatments for cancer, for instance, and all that, but I still have not come to a conclusion of why, little kids have to have cancer the way they do. They recover very quickly, most of them, but it's a very sobering thing. But getting back to what you said, when you touch somebody and you start making that skin incision, you're committed. There is no going back. And you don't have a book in front of you. Look, this artery goes here and that tendon goes there, etc. You just got to have it right here in the brain, right there. And you've got to be committed. You've got to have courage. I was blessed at Reading when we still had the groups. We had a lovely group of nurses who knew what you were doing. All of us who were plastic surgeons would go into that operating room feeling very confident that we had backing from the nurses, that they would help us as much as they can. I don't know how long more we're going to have surgeons, to be quite honest with you. There are literally robots out there being trained to cut and to do and stuff like that. So I'm sure we'll still have that for a while yet. But I've always been privileged. I never wanted to go back, even if I had another life, I could go back and redo it. I would never do anything different than what I did, no matter how hard it was. For one thing, I was much younger in those days, and I guess maybe a little bit more foolish or something. I don't know. But from this perspective of my age, I can look back and say, yeah, that was the thing to do. And when I was an intern at Reading, that rotating internship took you through obstetrics. I did at least 50 deliveries and learned from the group there how to do babies. The only thing I regret there was that I didn't take all their names so I could get to know the adults that I had delivered at Reading Hospital. And I came about that much, that far from thinking, oh, well, maybe I should go into obstetrics. But in plastics, you get the everything. You get the pediatric part, sometimes the obstetric part, believe it, because of the incisions. And I did a lot of hand surgery. That was another thing. I subspecialized in hand surgery. So the intricacies of the hand and the tendons and so forth, it's still, kind of boggles my mind to this day.
Thank you for that. Gentlemen,
Yeah.
other questions for Dr. Smith?
I like to get to the art. I know you're quite an accomplished artist. Was your mother your inspiration for getting you started in that, or is that just a natural ability that you have on your own?
No, on my mother's side, which is the Wolfskill side, there's a line of, I don't know where they all came from. My grandmother, was a watercolor artist, and she was also an accomplished musician. She played, I think, 6 or 7 different instruments, mostly the piano and organ. And Mom got it through her. She was not formally educated in art. However, when I had, I guess it was when I was at high school, my class secretary's mother was an artist, and she did a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch art, facture art, and she taught my mom how to do it. And we still have some of her pictures and so forth around the house that she did, and she did a really great job. She did a lot of watercolor and mostly oils, and so I've been painting all my life too, but I just haven't had time to do much except for the past, let's say, 5 or 6 years. And so I enjoy doing it. So it's a good pastime.
I think the art, is related to what you do.
Yeah.
As a surgeon, my best friend's a dentist, and he says that the GPs are just surgeons and dentists who don't have the hands. It's in the hands. It's in your artistry, and what you do is not just a technical thing. It's an art.
No, that's right. It is an art, and it's an art with tissue. And I'll tell you the truth. But when I was in my own practice, I didn't mind cosmetic surgery, but mine was general plastic surgery. I did everything, and I said I did subspecialized in hand surgery. But the first several years when I was with the other group, We were all over the place. And at that time, Reading had a lot of industry here. And so we were getting a lot of those people from industry. And most of them had bad hand injuries. They get their hands stuck and mangled in hands. And I have so many slides of those. And my challenge was putting them back together again so they could get functional hands. And it was a massive challenge sometimes. But yeah, it's the art. I always liked the reconstruction more than I did the cosmetic part because, well, I won't go into details, but there were some people who had a lot of cosmetic surgery who would be an absolute pain in the butt afterwards. Even if you did a great job, there were little issues. They'd wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and say, "Oh, this is off here a little bit. That's off there a little bit." Blah 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 blah. You know, and oh my, do I have to go to work again to listen to this? You know, so if somebody was in a car accident, you fixed up their lacerated face. That was far better, I thought, than you're bringing them back to some degree of normalcy, and not trying to make them super beautiful. But that was the job. That was part of it.
Yep.
Okay. I think looking at the clock here, it's about 25 after. We have a couple of minutes of other material to cover, but maybe we can all just give Dr. Smith a round of applause here for a great talk. So thank you very much, Dr. Smith.